I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Giles Dickson. He's the CEO of WindEurope. WindEurope has over 400 members in 35 countries, and they're easily put, they are provoking the advantages of offshore wind. And he's here to tell us about how it is important to be an early mover and the strategic advantages of being an early mover, which is precisely where Norway is now, right?
Absolutely. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and it's great to see so many of you here. I'm sorry those of you who are sitting on the stairs or standing at the back there. I'm going to begin by showing you how the International Energy Agency sees the evolution of the European electricity mix over the next 30 years. I stress, this is the International Energy Agency. That's coal, nuclear, gas, other renewables, hydro mainly, and biomass, solar PV growing a bit. There we are. As I say, this is IEA. It's not WindEurope. This is from the World Energy Outlook. Last year, it says by 2027, wind becomes the #1 source of electricity in Europe. They will update this in November this year in the new World Energy Outlook. Who knows? Maybe wind will be becoming the #1 source of electricity even earlier than 2027. Why is this happening? The single most important reason is costs. Wind energy is now the cheapest form of new power generation in Europe. Onshore wind has been the cheapest for many years now. Again, this is not WindEurope data. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And these are their latest LCOE figures for Northwest Europe. The really striking thing is that offshore wind is now the second cheapest form of new power generation in Northwest Europe. Okay, so where is wind energy in Europe today? The blue bars show you the gigawatts of installed wind energy capacity in every country. The red bars are the share of wind in every country's electricity mix. In total, we have 190 gigawatts, and wind is now 14% of all of the electricity that we consume in Europe. You see, we have the Norwegian numbers here. 1.7 gigawatts, that was the number at the end of 2018. Today it's 2.1 gigawatts that you have installed, and that's 3% of your electricity. Of course, it's nearly all onshore wind. And in fact, 90% of all of the capacity here across Europe is onshore wind. And onshore wind will remain the majority of wind energy in Europe right through until 2050. Let me show you the numbers. Dark blue is onshore capacity, light blue is offshore. You see 2018 where we are today, 2030, big growth in offshore, yes, even bigger growth in onshore, and the same applies for 2050. And when you look at those onshore capacity numbers, don't forget, all of Europe's existing onshore wind will reach the end of its normal operational life between now and 2050 and will have to be repowered. So what you're seeing here is not only new wind farms being built onshore, but the repowering of existing onshore wind as well. Okay, let's go back to this map, and I'm now going to show you a version of it which is only offshore wind. There we are. Those are the numbers today. It's already 14% of all of Denmark's electricity consumption. Let's now look at the capacity numbers specifically. That's today. Big growth between now and 2030. And you'll see here, even the normally conservative WindEurope envisage, even today, before you have firm commitments from your government, we envisage 400 megawatts of offshore wind capacity in this country. That is Tampen, plus the Gasco, Enbridge, Nyhamna project for the gas processing plant. As I say, it's conservative. One hopes that that number will be, in fact, much larger. That's why you're gathered here today. Of course. Right, let's look and see exactly where the offshore wind farms are located. These are today's offshore wind farms in Europe. The red exist. They're operating. The yellow are currently under construction. The blue and the green are the projects under development or the project plans. Significant expansion is coming. Now, what is driving this expansion? Of course, we want to decarbonize the electricity system, but don't forget the electricity system is only 1/4 of all of the energy that we consume in Europe today. The second big driver behind the growth in wind energy is the growth of electricity in our energy system. Let's break that down. Here is energy consumption in Europe today, 13,000 terawatt hours. The blue is the electricity. The red is transport, and the yellow is heating. Let's look at the shares of renewables in those three segments. We've got to 30% renewable electricity. Not bad. Only 18% in heating. That's mostly biomass. And in transport, very poor. Only 8%, and that's mostly biofuels. Let's look at 2050. We will be consuming less energy in Europe by 2050 because we will be becoming more energy efficient. But look how the share of electricity grows in the energy mix because we will be electrifying transport and heating. These are the WindEurope numbers now. Okay? And we're quite aggressive on electrification. We think we can get to 62% electricity in the energy mix by 2050. Eurelectric say 50%. No, Eurelectric say 60%. The European Commission say 50%. So everybody is envisaging that the blue gets a lot bigger by 2050. Let's now look at the share of renewables. Look at that. Nearly, well, a clear majority of that electricity is renewables. And that is the key thing that is driving demand for renewable electricity. Shares of renewables go up with some biomass and biofuels in heating and transport as well. Okay, now let us look at what all this means for the growth in offshore wind in Europe. I've said the European Commission thinks we'll get to 50% electricity in the energy mix by 2050. Okay, so what does this mean for offshore wind? Okay, first of all, look at that blue bar in the bottom left-hand corner. That's offshore wind capacity in Europe today, which means we are building 3 gigawatts a year of offshore wind. By 2030, we will have around 80, possibly 85 gigawatts of offshore wind, which means that our annual installations will rise to 4 gigawatts a year in the first part of the next decade, and then in the second half to 7 gigawatts a year. Now look at the 2050 numbers for offshore wind capacity of the European Commission. At least 240 gigawatts, they say. And that means every year we'd be building 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, 3 times more than what we're building today. But 240 is only the bottom of the Commission's 8 scenarios for 2050. In their top scenario, they think we'll need 450 gigawatts of offshore wind in Europe by 2050, which would mean installing 19 gigawatts every year. Some of it fixed bottom, some of it floating. Now, I showed this slide to Liv Lernum and to the energy ministers of the 9 other countries of the European North Seas offshore wind cooperation process at a meeting in Esbjerg in Denmark in June. They were meeting together with the European Commission. And this made quite an impression on the ministers that were present. And it immediately raises some questions. Where are we going to put all of these offshore wind farms? Today we have nearly 20 gigawatts, and it's already taking up quite a lot of space of Europe's seas. Where are we going to put 450 gigawatts? Second question, how are we going to connect it all to the grid? Third question, do we have the industrial capacity in Europe to produce 19 gigawatts of offshore wind equipment every year? Today, at maximum capacity, our supply chain could do 7 gigawatts. It's doing 3, could do 7. We need more factories. So I set out these 3 challenges to the ministers, and they said, look, you need to do some further work on this, please. Can you come back and tell us what these huge numbers mean for marine spatial planning? Because we have our fishermen, we have our shipping lanes, we have our military, we have our biodiversity interests. What do they mean also for connections to the grid? Are we going to be able to connect all this capacity to the grid? Where are the grid connections going to go? Are we going to have a shared grid or a meshed grid in the North Sea? And what does it mean for the supply chain? Do we need to build new factories? What does that mean for jobs and growth? Maybe very interesting. So, WindEurope is now writing a report which we will publish on the 26th of November this year on the mandate that we had from Liv Lernum and her 9 colleagues, which will answer these 3 questions. What does this mean for marine spatial planning, grid connections, and the supply chain? And we will publish it at the WindEurope offshore wind event in Copenhagen on the 26th of November. I can share with you now something of what the report will say. This is roughly electricity demand in Europe. Its population density. Okay, the factories, the industrial consumption is not in exactly the same places, but that's broadly where it is. And we know already that our report will say that 85% of all of the offshore wind capacity in Europe will have to come somewhere in the North Seas, which means North Sea, Baltic, English Channel, Irish Sea, west coast of France. The rest would be in the Mediterranean. When we publish the report, we will have a specific gigawatt figure for Norway, but I'm not yet in a position to share that with you. But I can tell you this, there will be a very big gigawatt figure for Norway's offshore wind capacity in 2050 when we publish this report. Now, why do we think Norway can and should have so much offshore wind capacity in 2050? There are 3 answers to that question. The first is this: capacity factors. These are the average capacity factors for wind energy in every country in Europe. The blue figures are onshore, the red figures are offshore. As you can see, you have the highest capacity factors for onshore wind, which means it makes sense to keep building onshore wind in this country. You have 2.1 gigawatts today. By the end of 2021, you will have 4.9 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity. There is no country in Europe that is expanding its onshore wind capacity as rapidly as Norway is in relative terms. And that is a good thing, because this is a very low cost, almost no cost, no regrets option. And as you go beyond that and deliver the aspirations that are in the national frame, that I know is open for consultation at the moment, then you will be delivering onshore wind at zero net cost to the society. This is a no cost, no regrets option for Norway. But, of course, you will have very high capacity factors for your offshore wind as well. So it makes sense for you to be developing it. The second reason why it makes sense is that you will be able to connect it to what everybody envisages will be a fully integrated electricity transmission network in Europe by 2050. This is what it looks like by 2050. These are the grand visions. The D that you can see there is the huge Dogger Bank site in the middle of the North Sea, very conveniently located where the EEZs of the UK, Denmark, Netherlands and others all come together. Very nice water depths. You can do fixed bottom offshore wind there. And you'll see that I have marked on here also 2 of the 3 zones that your government has identified for the development of offshore wind, including, of course, floating offshore wind. Your wind farms could connect in to this emerging North Sea wider European grid. Let's look and see what it would look like specifically in the North Sea. There we are. Now, the third reason why it makes sense for Norway to develop offshore wind is jobs and growth. There is huge industrial interest for you in becoming a leader in offshore wind, particularly, of course, floating offshore wind. As we've heard from Astrid, this technology is way past the R&D stage. It is very close to large-scale deployment. Okay? And this could bring huge employment and industrial benefits to Norway. Now, some people say to us, okay, so we can develop an industrial capacity, but what are the export opportunities going to be like? Okay, and can you really export wind energy equipment? It's very large and bulky elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world. Well, the answer is yes, you can, and there are many good examples of this that show how regions in Europe that have chosen to invest in wind energy industrial capacity have benefited. This is the current wind energy supply chain in Europe. You can see it is very spread out indeed. It's quite coastal, as you can see. And yes, it's concentrated in areas where there is a lot of wind energy capacity, but not necessarily. Let's take this specific example. This is Hull, previously a very deprived town in the northeast of England. As you know, now it is booming, thanks to the Siemens Gamesa investment in this blade factory, which has created 3,000 jobs, helping to build the UK's offshore wind farms. By the way, this Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning, the UK will announce the results of its latest offshore wind auction. We expect 6 gigawatts of new capacity to be awarded. It will be the world's largest ever wind energy auction. The target price is £53 per megawatt hour, including the cost of grid connection. The winning prices could well be lower than that. So watch this space Thursday morning. Okay, that's the UK. This is Denmark. And this is the port of Esbjerg, which is the world's largest port now for the marshalling of offshore wind equipment. You can see they have cleared a whole load of space here to lay the equipment for storage before it is taken out to sea. They have reinforced the port infrastructure so that they can take very heavy loads. They have deepened the berths. They have invested millions. And this is very important. It's put them in a very competitive position. Floating offshore wind is going to be very interesting. It has one cost advantage over fixed bottom offshore wind, of course, which is that you can do much of the assembly of the turbines onshore rather than paying for the jack-up vessels and the cranes to go out and install the turbines at sea. And it could well be that the ports become the manufacturing hub for floating offshore wind. The third region I want to highlight is this, the Basque Country in northern Spain. They don't have much wind. They hardly have any wind farms. It's not a good place to build wind farms at all. It's very hilly, mountainous. But they took a strategic decision 20 years ago to develop a wind energy industry. They knew it would be almost exclusively for export, elsewhere in Spain, elsewhere in Europe, and the world. And this has paid very rich dividends for them. And if you go back to our map, you'll see that this region is one of the main industrial hubs for wind energy in Europe. And they are thriving today on the back of the strategic decision they took 20 years ago. And maybe the strategic decision facing you and your government now is very similar for offshore wind to the one that the Basque government took 20 years ago. I leave you with those thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your attention.